Welcome to Making with Mark. In this video, we'll build the B2EMO Droid from Star Wars Andor. Let's get started. Whenever I start a new project, I try to pick a starting point to go off of. In this case, I'm going to use these drink bottle lids here for wheels for the droid. And I don't typically build to scale, I just build to what looks right. So I'm going to kind of figure out the spacing and determine the size of the droid based off of the wheels. So I'm going to start off here with a piece of EVA foam, and I'm just going to lay out the general size that I want, just based again off of the spacing of the wheels. So I start off by cutting out the first of several pieces that will be used to make the body of the droid. And although B2 may seem simple at first, if you look closer, there's quite a few angles going on here, so this should be interesting. So I added some guidelines just to help me when I make the cuts on the foam. This is just to keep things lined up, and it's going to be really important once I start stacking pieces. And once I had those cuts made, I went ahead and duplicated this piece, and I'll glue these up in due time. This is actually going to be the section, the topmost section of the droid's body before you get to the head. And again, looking at the inspiration, you can see there's a couple of gaps. So I'm just marking out those gaps, and I'll go ahead and cut those out, and then I'll glue these two pieces together. I thought it made more sense to do the cutout first than to try to glue it together and then do the cut afterwards. And once these pieces are cut, now comes the super satisfying part of popping out the center core. Now I'm going to trim out those pieces that make up the gap. Before we can attach these pieces, the edges are pretty rough, so we need to get those cleaned up. And this is where the rotary tool really comes in handy. With these pieces cleaned up and ready to go, it's time for some hot glue. Now we just stick the two parts together. And we'll add the little bit on the corner. And now we're ready to go ahead and continue building out the rest of the body. And after cutting several more pieces, it's time to start gluing up more sections of the droid's body. Next, I use the rotary tool with a sanding wheel to smooth those rough edges out. So after putting together the three body sections, I needed a way to space them apart from one another. I used a scrap piece of cardboard to cut out a couple of sections, and I noticed that one was just a little too thin, so I went ahead and doubled those up, glued them together, and then assembled the body parts. In order to get a nice clean edge on the spacers, I cut a strip of cardboard and I just glued it and wrapped it all the way around these spacer pieces. And that really comes in handy in the finishing stages. It's going to make it a lot easier to cover and fill, and it'll be a nice flat surface to finish rather than the open ends of the cardboard. With the main body of the droid now assembled, it's time to move on and start working on those wheels. Now I'll come back and revisit the way you see the body here. It's going to change quite a bit in the near future, but I'll cover that when I get to it. I took some sheet styrene and This is a perfect backer material for the wheels, which again are bottle caps. So I just cut out some strips, enough for each bottle cap to fit to. And then I took some 150 grit sandpaper and just scuffed up the lids. And this is really going to help with the adhesion to the styrene. It'll stick pretty good without it, but this really improves it quite a bit. And then I go to my trusty super glue here, and I just want to apply a little bit around the edges, and then affix each wheel to the styrene. I repeat this for all 4 wheels. And then it's on to some baking powder just to lock in that styrene to the lid. Once that's complete, just took a heavy-duty pair of scissors, cut around the outside of each wheel. I can remove most of the styrene this way, which is going to save a lot of time when it comes to sanding and grinding. And this is what each one will look like. Then I use a sanding wheel on my rotary tool, and I'm just going to ease the wheel around and take off just a little bit. I just want to clean that edge up nice and smooth so that it matches with the contour of the bottle cap. So a little bit of sanding, and then I'm left with this. And I'll go ahead and repeat that for all the wheels. A little bit of hand sanding just to do some final touch up, and these wheels are looking pretty good. Next, decided to go ahead and start building these fenders, the little side pieces on the droid. I'm making these out of cardboard strips, and again, like before, I just want to make these proportional to the body and the wheels. So I took some measurements and then laid out what I thought would be about the right dimensions to make it look right. Cut these pieces out, and this is what I'm shooting for. I just work out the spacing, then cut some more pieces out of cardboard, glue those edges, and then we can start assembling with another band of cardboard. I found that it's easier to actually put these pieces down flat and wrap the cardboard around. The only problem is the glue tends to want to stick to the cutting mat, but that's okay, it comes off pretty easily. Then once I have the outer shape, I need to repeat that piece on the back side. So I just place it on top of some more cardboard, then cut it out. A little bit of glue on the wheel, and I want to be sure and space the wheel so that it sticks out the right amount. And I'm just eyeballing it again, nothing exact here. A little bit of a filler strip just to make up the difference between the fender and the wheel. That'll also give some support for the back. Then I add some glue to the inside of the fender and the spacer piece. And finally, the inside piece of the fender. So far I'm pretty happy with the way that's turning out. Moving on to the back fender, I just took a look at what I thought would fit the dimensions, then roughed out a shape. And here I'm just cutting some pieces that are gonna sort of box it out and finish the look. I duplicate those for the inner and outer pieces. And with all of the pieces cut out, it's time to go ahead and start assembling the wheels. So again, just placing those where I think they should go inside of this fender piece. This is kind of what I'm going for that rear fender. A little glue on the edge, just like on the front. Then I can start putting those pieces together. Now repeat the same process as the front wheels. Add some glue, place it inside the fender, and just line it up how I want it. I go ahead and continue that until I have both sets of wheels completed. For the droid's head, I cut out a couple more pieces of the EVA foam, and these pieces are going to be stacked so that I can get the right height. And I cut those with my razor knife. I've added some grid lines just to make it easier to do the cut, and then I glued these two pieces. Using my bandsaw, just cut this bevel cut. I considered doing this with the razor and a ruler, but it's very tedious, and this is where the bandsaw just does an excellent job. So I work my way around cutting the bevels on each side. And then I mark out these corner cuts. And this is part of the complexity of his head. And again, the bandsaw just does a great job, so much better than I could do by hand. With a pair of scissors, I decided to create this edge detail. On the actual model, it's not a crisp line. And at this point of the project, I was pretty happy with the way the wheels and the fenders turned out. But the body bugged me a little bit. You can see I experimented with some glue and some other filler on the back of the model, and that was just to see if I could seal the foam a little bit better. The biggest problem I had to this point, though, was this middle section was just too thick. In the original model, in the inspiration photos, the midsection should be a little thinner than the bottom section. And because they were almost identical, it just didn't look right, and it made the droid too tall. So I split the droid apart, took a section out of the middle, and here I'm just gluing it back. And you can see the glue holds really, really well. Maybe not quite as good as contact cement on the foam, but it does a good job. And here I've added some spacer pieces of cardboard in, and I'm going to build those up a little bit so that I can get the spacing right for the headpiece. More glue, and then I apply the headpiece to it. I cut the notches in on the bottom left and right of the droid, and this is to accommodate the fender pieces. There's another piece that'll fit in here into these slots, and then the fender's attached to it. So I just mocked up a piece of EVA foam here that I thought would work, and this is kind of what I'm going for. So with everything attached, I set out to start on one of the most recognizable parts of B2EMO, and that's this eyepiece. So I used my grinding wheel to rough out the shape. And here I'm applying a coat of epoxy. This is going to do a couple of things. For one, it's going to seal the foam and the cardboard and make the model much more rigid. And that way we can finish it and smooth it out and do all sorts of things. And this is where things started to go off the rails a little bit. I had this modeling clay. I kept thinking, you know what, I could probably build out the shape of the droid and fill in some of these gaps and smooth it out if I use some of this modeling clay and then cover that with another layer of epoxy. And this is what happens when things get a little haywire with the modeling clay. And I have to tell you, I actually gave up on this project for a couple of days. Wasn't happy with the way things were going. And even after trying to apply another coat of epoxy and doing some sanding and cutting, it just didn't go well. So I actually discarded the model and moved on to a different project. And wouldn't you know it, a couple days went by and I started thinking, it's funny that I pride myself on repurposing and saving things from the junk bin, and yet I threw a model into the junk bin. But that's okay. After a couple days, I had some new focus, and I decided to go ahead and start the project again. Now, off camera, I made quite a few changes and upgrades to the droid. I shortened him quite a bit, reworked several features, added another coat of epoxy, and then I used milliput, which is a two-part epoxy clay. Now the advantages of milliput are very noticeable over modeling clay. So milliput, being an epoxy, sets up in a few hours and becomes rock solid. It's very easy to sand and work. It's just a pleasure to work with. Very cool to make custom pieces and fill in gaps. That worked much better than the modeling clay that basically never hardens. So here you can see I took equal parts of both the resin and hardener for the epoxy. Blend those really well. I like to use the nitrile gloves to keep it from sticking to me. Then once you got a uniform color, it's just like working with Play-Doh as a kid. I basically made some strands, kind of like I had done with the modeling clay, but this time it worked a whole lot better. So I filled in the gaps between the body parts, started leveling out some of the low areas, and then I did a whole bunch of sanding once that had set up. So I just repeated this process several times, each time making sure that I got things more and more refined and more smooth. And then I went to a product called Spackle to fill in some of the final gaps and to build up a few areas that I felt like needed some special attention. And Spackle is also very good to work with. It's easy to sand and it dries fairly quickly. And once all of the body was sanded and proportioned the way I wanted it, then it was time to go in and do some details. So here I'm using sheet styrene that I've cut down into small strips. And then I'll apply those with some glue and baking soda, or baking powder in this case. So I'm just building up the fenders. There's quite a bit of detail here on the droid in the back portion of the fenders. What I did is I glued on the parts. I got them close to the size that they needed to be, but I sanded them to the finished size. Felt like that was going to be much easier than trying to build them the finished size. And that also allowed me to fill in gaps with some of the glue and the baking powder. And here I'm adding more details. This band that goes across the top of the fenders is a pretty neat little detail. It's easy to do with the styrene. It bends very easy, glues up really well. And much like the other details, I glued it on and then I went back and added more glue and baking powder just to seal the edges. I continued working my way around the droid, adding in the detail pieces of styrene as I went. And here you can sort of see the front bumper on the front fender. And then I added in these neat little details on each of the faces of the side of the droid. Some of them are skinny and some of them are a little wider. And I had these fish eyes from some fishing lures that I had made several years ago, and I'd held on to them. Here's an example of the eye on a lure. And I saw these and I was like, you know what? That would be a pretty cool looking eye. So even though I knew I would paint over it and I wouldn't leave the actual fish eye, it had that dome shape that I really was looking for, and it fit perfect on one of these plastic washers. And I admit I was tempted to leave it that way, and maybe I should have, but we're not going for a fish eye this time, we're going for a droid eye. So I continued adding little bits of details, then a coat of primer and a coat of red paint, and this is where we are. And now adding on some finishing touches. This is aluminum that I'm actually brushing on here for the slots in between the body pieces. Added in some black details. And then on the original droid, this back portion of the fender is yellow, which really is a distinguishing feature. It stands out. And for the yellow color, I had a can of canary yellow Krylon spray paint. So I just brushed that on using a throwaway brush. And because this red is so bright, this is actually a sunrise red color, it's a Rust-Oleum. But because it's so bright, it did take several coats to cover it up. And this is actually the last major bit of detailing other than distressing and weathering. And I also did a little bit of silver brushing just to kind of give it a weathered and distressed look. Overall, I was extremely happy with this project and so glad that I took it back out of the trash can and finished it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure and check out my other scratch-built robot videos.